Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. Today we continue with Chapter 14, Part B. In the meantime, Butler was conducting his propaganda in the press with consummate ability and tact. He published a series of articles on the decline of the authority of the Church in all civilized countries, which attracted great attention amongst all intelligent men. In these articles he offered elaborate proof of the general revolt against the Church. Both France and Italy had been compelled to disown the Church because the Church no longer represented and expressed modern needs. In both countries, the men who shaped opinion, the real leaders of the nation, were agnostics and even atheists. In London, which might be regarded as the center of Protestantism, not more than 1 million people out of 5 million attended public worship. England had taken the alarm. The leaders of all the churches, united by a common danger, had published a manifesto protesting against the increasing desecration of the Sabbath. In America, the case was much worse, because while the lessened authority of the Church was more evident, yet there was no perception of danger. He published a census of the church attendance in some of the most prominent districts of New York. The census revealed the fact that not more than 1% of the leading churches of New York had full congregations. Some of the churches which figured most prominently came off worse. In one leading Fifth Avenue church seated for 2,000 worshipers, and formerly the scene of famous ministry, the congregation numbered less than 500. Even in Brooklyn, the city of churches, as they were pleased to call it, more than 1 million persons never entered a church. From some of the New England cities, but especially from the Midwest, he had obtained reports carefully compiled by special commissioners, which proved much more disastrous. One leading denomination in Chicago, with many churches occupying fine sites, could report not one as even moderately prosperous. In one, the galleries had been closed for several years. They were no longer needed. Another had been without a minister so long that the congregation had wholly deserted it. In others, whose size witnessed the success of earlier days, the present congregation was a discouraged handful. And yet on any given Sunday night, the places of entertainment flared with light. The theaters were crowded, concerts were thronged, and pleasure and frivolity reaped their fullest harvests. He drew a striking, even more pathetic picture of the condition of the minister in these churches. He deserved sympathy, for he was a brave man conducting a forlorn hope that led to nothing. There were thousands of ministers who knew they were beaten men, but were incapable of understanding why. Some of them, in despair, adopted sensational methods and indulged in what might be called illicit preaching to attract the crowds, and those were the only men who succeeded. The man of finer taste, of deeper spirituality, of real scholarship, was not listened to. He bore his defeat in silence, and often died of it. It was a notorious fact that the best men no longer entered the ministry. The bishops of the Anglican Church in England had publicly deplored the fact, and all who had anything to do with universities and theological seminaries in America were perfectly aware of it. Why was this? Cynics would no doubt reply because of the rising youth of America had discovered that much more money was to be made in any other profession than the ministry. But that was a libel on youth. The real reason was that the youth of brilliant parts had discovered that the ministry was an intolerable bondage. Such men would gladly give themselves to the ministry if it afforded them an opportunity to commensurate with their powers, and would be content with its modest rewards. But they declined to become the slaves of an institution that robbed them of the right to think freely, bound them by antiquated precedents, and ground out their lives in pilfering trivialities. The result was that the men of real energy, of intellect and brilliant powers, of initiation, refused the ministry. And more the greatest function in the world, that of the prophet, was given over to inferior men who performed their tasks mechanically and were wholly unable to express the ideas which agitated thoughtful people. Yet America could not live without a living church. The fortunes of the Republic were bound up with the fortunes of the church. All history proved that the decline of religion in a nation meant the decline of the nation. Let the present processes go on unchecked for another quarter of a century, and the end was clear. The dawn of the year 1930 would reveal a pagan America, an America from which the last vestige of Christianity had vanished, leaving pure paganism as the one governing principle in national life. Day after day, these striking articles appeared in Butler's paper. Had they appeared in the religious press, they would probably have attracted little attention. But appearing as they did in the most authoritative daily journal in America, written as they were with both sympathy and knowledge, and expressed in language at once caustic and temperate, they attracted the attention of the whole nation. They were reprinted in 1,000 journals. They were discussed in business offices and clubs. The expression pagan America fixed itself upon the popular memory. The evening papers took it up and published sensational episodes and statistics of New York misery and crime. Sickening details were given of squalor and vice, and the question was asked occasionally in real earnestness, but often in derision, "What is the church doing?" The term pagan America found its way into the comic papers, which presented their readers with barbaric pictures of what might be supposed to happen in 1930, when America had reverted to type. Music hall singers used it as a catchword in their songs, associated it with most banal and vulgar ideas, and often with thinly disguised profanity and indecency. The gilded youth of New York asked one another over their cocktails, "Are you a pagan?" and found a new form of wit in christening a new and complicated cocktail, liquid paganism. But beneath all this characteristic levity, there sounded a note of real alarm. It was as though a sudden gulf had opened, toward which an entire nation was seen as rushing at a frantic gallop. Sober and serious men of all shades of thought, who had already been alarmed by the constant revelations of corruption and fraud in the great insurance societies and in municipal and political world, began to realize for the first time that all this gangrene was a chicanery which was eating out the honor and life of the nation, had its origin in the decay of the religious sentiment. These things could not have existed had not the restraint of religion been relaxed. Religion, therefore, became the urgent question of the hour, and the form which that question was bound to take was precisely the form Butler had foreseen. Was it yet possible to free the genuine spirit of religion from its decaying forms, to rescue it from enfeebling theologies and traditions, to make it once more a genuine impulse and inspiration in the lives of men? One day Dr. Jordan sought an interview with Butler. He brought with him a resolution of protest against Butler's articles, requesting that it might be published in the Daily Light. "I certainly will publish it if you wish," said Butler, "but I think you are ill-advised to request it." "But you will find that the protest is signed by 20 ministers, some of them among the most prominent in New York," Jordan said stiffly. "Probably they know their own business better than you do." "That is precisely what I venture to doubt," replied Butler. "You know it is the looker-on who sees the most of the game." He gravely examined the names and signatories of the protest. "I see your own name on there, Dr. Jordan. Suppose you give me your own views, for I imagine that the protest is your work." "Yes, sir," said Jordan pompously. "The protest emanates from me, and I am not ashamed of it. In my opinion, your articles are calculated to damage the prestige of the church." "Prestige is a small matter, Dr. Jordan. It is merely the mirage of false pride. The only vital question is whether or not these articles are true." "They may be true in point of fact," said Jordan, "but they nevertheless create a false impression." "You must forgive me, Dr. Jordan, but I am only a plain man, and I can't for the life of me see how a thing that is true can produce an impression that is false." Butler's tone of banter offended Jordan's dignity and made him angry. "Oh, I am not to be put off with words," he exclaimed. "I know what you mean to do. You mean to support that pestilent fellow Gaunt. I wouldn't wonder if he wrote the article himself. It would be just what might be expected. The man who can't manage to stay in the church no sooner leaves than he usually proceeds to foul his own nest." Butler turned to his desk and began correction of some proofs that demanded his attention. Without looking up, he said in quiet tones, I allow no one to shout in my office, Dr. Jordan. You have said things which I am sure you will be glad to forget, and I prefer to forget that I have heard them. I don't want you to forget them, blustered Jordan. I warn you that the entire Church of New York will prove hostile to you and your precious protege. I therefore repeat, pardon me, but you will repeat nothing of what you have already said. Repeat it outside if you like, and get those to agree with you who will. I am busy. Good morning. Jordan had no option but to go. Then you will not print my protest, he said. I ought to have known that the editors would only publish what agrees with their own views. On the contrary, I will print it with pleasure, even with malicious pleasure if you like, but you will find that it will do you little good. Jordan left in a white heat of rage. There goes a fellow, thought Butler, who ought to have lived in the days of Torquemada. He'd burn his best friend for a difference of opinion. I'm perfectly sure he'd crucify me with pleasure. Butler related the incident to Gaunt the same evening, and Gaunt's comment was characteristic. Don't be hard on Jordan, he said. He's really a good man who works with a vast industry for his church, but he suffers from constriction of vision, which isn't altogether his fault. There's a curious fact in optics which I came across the other day, which explains Jordan. It is stated that people who live on the prairies or in the African veld have an extraordinary range of vision because the eye has to accommodate itself daily to vast spaces. People who live among walls, on the contrary, have very short vision, and the prairie dweller, if he comes to live in the city, soon finds his eye accommodating itself to the narrower range. Well, that's Jordan's case. He's always lived among walls, church walls, I suppose, and knows nothing about open spaces. You are more charitable in your views of him than I am, said Butler. Not more charitable, only a little more exact, said Gaunt. You see, I know him better, and you know the proverb, to know all is to forgive all. I suppose you would say that our business is to get Jordan and his kind into open spaces. Oh, he'll have to come out when the walls fall down, Gaunt said cheerfully. They're already beginning to tremble, thanks to your seismic efforts. And this was the truth of the matter, as Butler thankfully admitted. There lay upon his desk hundreds of letters from ministers in all parts of the country, many of them infinitely pathetic in their confessions of patient failure, and their eager hope that at length the dawn of deliverance was near. Many similar letters had reached Gaunt, and they gave both Butler and himself a new respect for the American ministry. Contrary to all previous expectations, they began to perceive that the strength and possibility of triumph for the movement lay in the ministers themselves. No doubt men of Jordan's type would be obstinately hostile, but there were others, especially the younger men, whose temper was wholly different. These men were not blind to their conditions. If they were involved in the failure of the church, it was not so much their fault as their misfortune. They had set to perform an impossible task with machinery that was wholly out of date. Gaunt knew the type well, men of sturdy manhood who had fought their way through colleges and seminaries by indomitable sacrifice, who had stoked furnaces or worked on railways to earn money for their training, who were of incorruptible courage, and because they were courageous, fought on silently and made no complaint. But they knew well why they had failed. They knew that they had never had the freedom requisite for success, and these men would rally to the movement. So day by day the press campaign went on, and daily the public interest deepened. During this month of February, Gaunt had become the most talked of man in America. And that's the end of Chapter 14, Part B. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 15, Part A, The Vision. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.